On my wedding day, every seat reserved for my family stayed empty. They all chose to attend my sister's promotion dinner instead. But as we cut the cake, my phone lit up with 26 missed calls and a text from my sister asking for help. I, 29M, stood at the altar and watched every single seat reserved for my family remain empty. The venue looked perfect. White roses lined the aisle, soft music played, and my bride stood beside me looking like a dream. But rows 3 through 8 on my side, all those carefully labeled seats with little cards bearing my family's names, stayed mockingly vacant. 26 empty chairs that might as well have been 26 slaps across my face. My best friend leaned over during the ceremony and whispered that maybe they were running late. I just shook my head. I knew exactly where they were. 3 weeks earlier, my younger sister had announced she was having a dinner party to celebrate her promotion to senior marketing associate. She picked the same date as my wedding. Not close to it. Not near it. The exact same evening at the exact same time. When I called Mom to point out the obvious conflict, she got quiet for a moment before suggesting maybe I could move my wedding date. After all, my sister had worked so hard for this promotion, and the reservation at that expensive restaurant was non-refundable. I told her my wedding had been planned for 8 months. The venue was booked, deposits were paid, and guests had already made travel arrangements. She sighed like I was being difficult and said she would see what she could do. What she did was choose my sister. Dad called 2 days before the wedding to tell me they had decided to attend the promotion dinner. He explained that my sister really needed the family's support right now because work had been stressful, and besides, she was younger and still finding her way. I would understand, wouldn't I? Marriage was just one day, but family was forever. I asked him if he realized what he was actually saying. He told me not to be dramatic and hung up. My 2 brothers sent a joint text. They were going to the dinner because Mom had already RSVP'd for everyone, and it would look bad if they didn't show up. One of them added that I was being selfish for making this about me when our sister had achieved something important. The morning of my wedding, my aunt sent a message saying she hoped I would understand why she couldn't come. My sister had specifically requested her presence, and she didn't want to cause family drama by choosing sides. So I stood there and got married with my entire side of the church looking like a ghost town. My wife's family kept glancing over with confused and pitying expressions. Her mother squeezed my hand before the ceremony started and told me family came in all forms, and sometimes the one we chose meant more than the one we were born into. The ceremony was beautiful despite everything. My wife cried. I cried. We said our vows and meant every word. For a few hours, I managed to push away the hollow feeling in my chest and focus on the woman I was building a life with. The reception was smaller than planned, but warm. My college friends filled in some of the empty spaces, and my wife's cousins made sure we always had someone to talk to. We cut the cake around 9 o'clock. White buttercream with raspberry filling, exactly what we had wanted. Cameras flashed. Everyone cheered. That was when my phone started buzzing in my pocket. I ignored it the first few times. This was my wedding reception, and I wasn't about to let my family ruin any more of it. But the buzzing didn't stop. It became persistent, frantic. My best friend finally handed me my phone with a concerned look and told me I should probably check it. 26 missed calls, all from various family members. 13 voicemails, and 1 text from my sister. The text just said, "Help. Please. Emergency." My stomach dropped despite everything. No matter how angry I was, she was still my sister. I stepped outside into the cool evening air and called her back. She answered on the first ring, and I could immediately tell she had been crying. She asked where I was, her voice desperate and shaking. I reminded her that I was at my wedding reception, the one she had decided to skip. She started crying harder and said she needed me to come right now. Something terrible had happened. I asked her what was wrong. She said everyone had gotten food poisoning at the restaurant. Severe food poisoning. People were vomiting, collapsing, and the ambulances were taking too long. She begged me to come help, to drive people to the hospital, to do something. Mom was unconscious. Dad was barely coherent. Both my brothers were on the floor of the bathroom. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I stood there in my tuxedo, looking back through the glass doors at my wife laughing with her grandmother, at the life we were celebrating, at the people who had actually shown up for us. I asked my sister if she remembered what Dad had told me on the phone. The part about marriage being just one day, but family being forever. She didn't understand what I was getting at, and kept begging me to hurry. I told her I remembered it very clearly. I remembered every single conversation, every text message, every justification for why my wedding didn't matter as much as her dinner party. She started screaming that this was serious, that people could die, that I was being cruel. I asked her if she had any idea how cruel it felt to stand at an altar and see every seat for my family empty. She said that was different and I was being petty and vindictive. I told her she was absolutely right. I was being petty, but I was also being consistent. She had made it very clear that her dinner party was more important than my wedding. So now she could handle the consequences of her dinner party without me. I suggested she call literally anyone else in the city before calling the brother whose wedding she couldn't be bothered to attend. She called me a monster and hung up. The calls kept coming. My aunt called crying and asking how I could abandon the family in a crisis. One of my brothers managed to call between bouts of vomiting to tell me I would regret this for the rest of my life. Mom's best friend called on my mother's behalf to say I should be ashamed of myself. I turned off my phone, went back inside, and danced with my wife. The next morning, I woke up to over 100 messages. Most were from extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years, all telling me what a heartless person I was. A few were from my parents' friends who felt compelled to weigh in on my character. 3 were from my brothers calling me every name they could think of. Eventually, I read through the full story from various sources. The food poisoning had been severe, but not life-threatening. Everyone had ended up in the ER, and most were kept overnight for observation and for fluids. Mom had fainted from dehydration, which made it seem worse than it was. By morning, everyone was recovering, though they felt awful and would for several days. My sister sent another text asking if I was happy now that I had made my point. I didn't respond. What I did do was post a very simple message on social media. I thanked everyone who had come to our wedding and made it a beautiful day. I posted photos of the ceremony, the empty seats clearly visible in several shots, and mentioned how meaningful it was to be surrounded by people who loved and supported us. I didn't mention my family specifically. I didn't have to. The empty chairs told the whole story. The comments section exploded. My wife's family members started filling in context. Some of my friends who knew the situation added their perspectives. Distant relatives who hadn't known there was a conflict began asking questions. My sister's promotion dinner suddenly became very public knowledge, as did the timing of it. People started doing the math on their own. Mom called me 3 days later from home. She said we needed to talk about what happened and how to move forward as a family. I asked her which part she wanted to talk about, the part where she chose a dinner party over her son's wedding, or the part where she expected that same son to abandon his reception to help with a problem that emergency services were already handling. She said I was twisting things, and that family meant being there in emergencies. I pointed out that a wedding seemed like a pretty important family event too, but apparently my definition of important didn't match hers. She started crying and said she never thought I would hold a grudge like this. I told her I wasn't holding a grudge. I was simply recognizing the priority system she had established and operating within it. She had shown me exactly where I ranked in the family hierarchy. I was just accepting that information and adjusting my expectations accordingly. Dad got on the phone and demanded to know what my problem was. He said everyone made mistakes, and I was acting like a spoiled child who didn't get enough attention. I asked him if he would have skipped my brother's wedding for a dinner party. He said that was different. I asked him how. He couldn't answer, just told me I was being unreasonable and hung up. My brothers sent a joint message saying I had embarrassed the entire family with my social media post and my refusal to help during the emergency. They demanded I take it down and apologize. I responded by blocking both of them. Update 1. 2 weeks went by without any contact from my family. My wife and I went on our honeymoon to Ireland as planned. We hiked through green hills, stayed in tiny village inns, and managed to not think about the drama for a few blessed days. When we returned, there were 17 messages waiting from my aunt. She wanted to meet for coffee to discuss the situation. She emphasized that she came in peace and just wanted to understand both sides. I almost deleted the messages, but my wife suggested I hear her out. Sometimes having a neutral third party could help, she said. I wasn't convinced my aunt was neutral, but I agreed to meet. We sat in a coffee shop downtown on a Tuesday morning. My aunt looked tired, older than I remembered. She ordered a latte and asked how the honeymoon was. I told her it was good. She nodded and got straight to the point. She said the family was fracturing and I needed to be the bigger person and apologize. I asked her why I should apologize for not ruining my wedding reception to help people who had deliberately skipped my wedding. She said it was about the emergency, not the wedding. Those were two separate issues. I told her they weren't separate at all. They were directly connected. My family's choices had consequences, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make everyone comfortable. She got frustrated and said my sister hadn't meant for anyone to get food poisoning. Obviously, the emergency wasn't intentional. I agreed the food poisoning wasn't intentional, but the decision to schedule a dinner party on my wedding day absolutely was intentional. The decision for every single family member to skip my wedding was intentional. Those choices had shown me exactly how much they valued me. She called me stubborn and said I was throwing away my family over pride. I corrected her. I wasn't throwing them away. They had already thrown me away. I was just declining to be their backup plan when their first choice went wrong. The conversation ended badly. She left and sent a message to the family group chat that I refused to see reason and maybe everyone should just give me space to cool off. But something else happened that week that changed things. My sister lost her job. The food poisoning incident had made the news in a small way. Local restaurant, multiple hospitalizations, health department investigation. My sister's name came up in some of the coverage because she had organized the event. Her company's HR department saw the articles and also noticed the social media drama surrounding it. Apparently, some of her coworkers had figured out she had scheduled her celebration on her brother's wedding day, and the office gossip got brutal. Her boss called her in for a meeting about professional judgment and company representation. They didn't fire her for getting food poisoning. They fired her for what they called a pattern of poor decision-making and creating workplace drama that affected team morale. The promotion was revoked, and she was let go entirely. She blamed me completely. The message she sent was long and venomous. She said I had ruined her life by posting those photos and making everything public. If I had just kept quiet and handled it privately, none of this would have happened. Her career was destroyed, her reputation was in tatters, and it was all my fault for being vindictive. I read the message twice and then blocked her number. Mom called immediately after, screaming about how proud I must be for destroying my sister's livelihood. I asked her if she thought my sister's choices might have had something to do with her consequences. She said I was the one who made everything public and turned it into a scandal. I reminded her that I had simply posted wedding photos and thanked the people who attended. The truth had done the rest. Dad sent an email because I wouldn't answer his calls. The email was long and detailed, explaining how I had always been jealous of my sister and had finally found a way to hurt her. He listed examples going back to childhood, times when I had supposedly been competitive or resentful. He said this was proof of my true character and that he was ashamed of the man I had become. I saved the email and forwarded it to my wife without comment. She read it and then held me while I cried for the first time since the wedding. Not because I regretted what I had done, but because seeing it all laid out like that, the decades of favoritism, the patterns I had tried to ignore, hurt in a way I hadn't expected. Update 2. A month after the wedding, I got a call from my grandmother. My father's mother, the one person in the family who had sent a card and a check even though she was too frail to travel to the ceremony. She was 92 and had always been kind to me in a quiet, observant way. She asked me to visit her at her assisted living facility. I went the next day. She was sitting in her room with tea prepared, the good china she kept for special occasions. She poured me a cup and asked me to tell her everything that had happened, not the version she had heard from my father, but my version. I told her all of it. The dinner party announcement, the conversations with my parents, the empty seats, the emergency call, all of it. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me about my father's childhood. How my grandfather had favorites too. How my father had been the overlooked one, the one who never quite measured up to his older brother. She said she had tried to balance it, but my grandfather's preference had been strong and damaging. She said my father had sworn he would never do that to his own children, but people often repeated the patterns they grew up with, especially when they didn't recognize them. She suspected my father saw himself in my sister, the one who needed more support, more attention, more championing. And in doing so, he had become exactly like his own father, just with a different child bearing the weight. None of that excused anything, she said firmly. Understanding wasn't the same as accepting, but she wanted me to know it wasn't about me or my worth. It was about their brokenness. Then she did something unexpected. She asked for my banking information. When I hesitated, she explained that she had set up a trust years ago, split equally among her grandchildren. But she was changing it. My siblings were getting their shares reduced by half, and I was receiving what would have been their portions as well. She had already contacted her lawyer. I tried to argue, but she held up her hand. She said this wasn't about punishment. It was about consequences and clarity. My siblings and parents needed to understand that choices mattered, and she wasn't going to pretend they didn't. She asked me to promise that I would use the money wisely and build a good life with my wife. I promised. She passed away 6 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was the first time I had seen my family since the wedding. They were cold, barely civil. My sister wouldn't look at me. My brothers stood together like a wall, physically blocking me from my parents. At the reading of the will afterward, when the lawyer explained the changed trust distribution, my father stood up and walked out. My mother followed. My sister started crying and accused me of manipulating a dying old woman. The lawyer interrupted sharply and said my grandmother had been completely lucid and very specific about her wishes. She had even left a letter explaining her reasoning, which he read aloud. In it, my grandmother wrote that she hoped this would teach her grandchildren that family loyalty went both ways and respect had to be earned through action, not demanded through obligation. She expressed disappointment in how my wedding had been handled and hoped that one day they would understand the lesson. My siblings left immediately after. I stayed to sign papers and thank the lawyer. He told me quietly that my grandmother had been very clear-minded about everything and had actually seemed pleased with her decision. She had mentioned me often in their meetings, always with pride. That evening, my wife and I sat on our apartment balcony and talked about everything. She asked me if I felt guilty about the money. I told her honestly that I didn't. My grandmother had made her own choice, just like my family had made theirs. What I felt was grief, not for the relationship with my family, because that had clearly been broken for a long time, but for the years I had spent trying to earn something that was never going to be given freely. Update 3. 6 months after the wedding, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was my mother. She said she was calling from a friend's phone because I had blocked her. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain. She asked if she could see me. Not to argue or convince me of anything, just to talk. I told her I would think about it, and ended the call. I did think about it. For 2 weeks, I turned it over in my mind. My wife said she would support whatever I decided, but reminded me that I didn't owe anyone access to my peace. In the end, I agreed to meet Mom in a public place, just the two of us. We met at a park near where I grew up. She looked older, grayer. She had lost weight. We walked along the path in silence for a while before she started talking. She said she had spent the past months thinking about everything. About the patterns my grandmother had mentioned, about the choices she had made, about me. She said she finally understood what she had done, not just with the wedding but over years and years of small decisions that had added up to this. She apologized. Not the defensive, excuse-filled kind of apology I had gotten before, but a real one. She said she couldn't undo any of it, couldn't give me back the wedding day or the years of being overlooked, but she wanted me to know that she finally saw it. She saw me. I asked her why it took losing me for her to figure that out. She said she didn't have a good answer except that sometimes people didn't value what they had until it was gone. She said she understood if I couldn't forgive her and wouldn't blame me for walking away completely. We walked for another hour. I didn't forgive her that day. I told her forgiveness wasn't something I could just hand over because she had finally acknowledged the problem. She nodded and said she understood. But I did agree to stay in contact. Slowly, carefully, with boundaries that I made very clear. My father never apologized. Neither did my siblings. As far as I know, they still believe they were right and I was cruel. I haven't spoken to any of them since the funeral. My wife and I used part of my grandmother's money as a down payment on a house. We planted a garden in the backyard and adopted a dog. We host dinners for our friends and my wife's family, and the table is always full. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled everything. The truth is, I don't. Every empty seat at my wedding taught me something important about who people really were when it mattered. The phone call I didn't answer taught me that I wasn't required to set myself on fire to keep other people warm. I think about my grandmother often, about what she said about patterns and choices. I think about the family I'm building now with my wife, and how we get to decide what values we pass on. And when I look at my wedding photos, I don't see the empty seats anymore. I see the full ones. I see the people who showed up. That's what I choose to remember,